Welcome to Patrick Henry Library. I'd like to welcome Shabnam Curtis to our program today. She reminded me that we have been working since 2019 to arrange this program. Can you read a little biography? Shabnam Curtis, the author of My Persian Paradox, was born and raised in Tehran, experiencing the Iranian Revolution of 1979 firsthand. In 2004, she immigrated to the United States, where she now works as a project analyst by day and a passionate writer at all other times. Shabnam teaches memoir writing workshops and has been performing lectures to colleges and universities about her book and the concept of sharing stories. She actively practices a variety of storytelling workshops to help people develop deeper empathy toward each other. She's working on her second memoir, a sequel to this one. Her articles and excerpts of her memoir have been published on a website called Why Writing About Social Issues is Important, The Right Launch, Views and News, the Canadian Business Daily, the Abstract Elephant Magazine, and Eat Darling, Eat Network. She lives in Virginia with her husband and 2 dogs. Her motto is, we all have a story to tell. Share your story, listen to others' stories. Create more empathy and love. Please join me in welcoming Shabnam Curtis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Denise. I appreciate it. Yes, you just mentioned it. I truly appreciate this event. You've been working hard on it for a long, long time. And thanks everyone for joining us. It's always an honor for me when I find people interested in my story. Yeah, I was born and raised in Iran, and I got to the point that I really wanted to share my story as not as an immigrant, as a person who raised in Iran, and the immigrant part of it comes next. But I do have a few slides. If I'm gonna go through them quickly, not to make anybody like a kind of like a boring presentation, but just the little points that remind me of what I want to talk about. I hope it's coming up. I'm sorry, it's trying, it's thinking. Can you see it yet?
It's not starting the slideshow. It's just showing the PowerPoint.
Okay. Maybe I'm just gonna stop it. Just gonna talk to it. No, it's not even stopping yet.
Yep, that's looking possible.
Okay, all right, sorry about that. So I don't know, my computer is not cooperating today. Like I said, after I immigrated, it was like 7-8 years after that, you know, like we all immigrate to the United States for that American dream, right? And a few years after, I thought I had it all, everything that I wanted. I had worked hard for it and I got it. And that's exactly when I felt a big void in my heart, a big pain in my heart. And obviously, of course, I felt like, why am I not grateful for everything I have? I worked hard for everything. Now I have my little family, this little house, a respectable job, but I just couldn't enjoy my life. Some people call it midlife crisis or, you know, like so many things, but I think it's the unlived life. I think it's when any of us get to that point, I got to learn that it's basically when we are still living in the past with all the pain of the past. And I was constantly thinking about the past. But as I started sharing my story with my friends, I felt better because I got their empathy. They were like, you know, like my friend, my girlfriend from the Midwest in America, my age, but she was sharing experience with me. And I was like, how could that even be possible? And then in the other side, I would share my story with other friends, and they were like, oh my God, we had no idea you had gone through these, or even living in Iran looked like this. And I got to really think hard about it. You know, the revolution that happened in Iran in 1979, the dictatorship took over. And then right after that, the war between Iran and Iraq started. So it put a lot of pressure on every single person in the country. And it traumatized a lot of people. And I was only 7 years old. So as a little child, I couldn't even understand what was going on. Just one little example, I remember the day that, that the United States Embassy was taken over by the fundamentalist Islamists. And I was very little, but I could see in my parents' faces how worried they were. And my father was like walking back and forth in the small apartment we had, and like, what is going on? Why do they do this? So people didn't, a lot of people didn't even expect all these sudden changes. And then Sharia law took over. And women, if they had any little right, they all lost it. So I just got to the point that, you know what, we write about a lot of extraordinary people, but we never write about ordinary people who went through all of these traumas. And if I share my story, it could represent many, many other stories of people who lived there. And surprisingly, we all also share experience, no matter what part of the world we lived. You know, I met my husband here. He was born and raised in America with Irish, French background. And we share a lot of experience. We share a lot of feelings, and we are human. It doesn't matter where we are, where we were born, where we were raised. We are human, and we want to be connected. And what I learned from writing this memoir was basically how paradox is a human being. A human being is a paradox, because we do different things from different aspects of our personality. We do different things under a stress, under survival mode, and when we actually live under a better condition. And those can be really contradictory. Or a father who you know, could be, because of his depression, could be an alcoholic, could also be a loving father in so many different points of his daughter's life. So I was just trying to put all of this together and to find out that writing memoir actually helped me to learn that us people are complicated, but we shouldn't see the face value. We should see what was behind it, what made what we did. Basically, I want to say writing this memoir helped me to develop more critical thinking skills, because I started seeing the connection between the social impacts, the childhood traumas, and how people actually behaved and why they behaved the way that they behaved. And then I published it, and I started sharing this story, and then I get, you know, all different feedback. The young girl comes to me and says, you know, my father is Iranian, almost your age. He never talks about those days, and I think I want to read your book to know my father better. And then this other person says, well, I had no idea you had gone through this. I didn't know anything about Iran close up. And doesn't Brene Brown says that we don't hate close up when we know people close up? When we read each other's stories, when we listen to each other's stories, we create a different bonding. We basically create more humanity with empathy. We start to grasping the concept of being in other person's shoes. And that's what makes me feel like this longing of wanting to share my story, not because I was an extraordinary person, because I was an ordinary person, like millions of other people who their voice wasn't heard. That was the reason I wanted to say, we also matter. Our stories matter, and I'm sure every one of you there have at least one story, and it matters. When we listen to each other's, when we share our stories, we just create a better world. And I appreciate, thank you for being here to share this story with me. I hope it's okay if I want to read a small excerpt of my story, and then we can go to Q&A, because I'd love to hear from you what you think about it, how you feel about it, and kind of like make a communication. Would that be okay, Denise? Is that okay if I just read a very small excerpt?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, this is actually the piece that was published in the Abstract Elephant magazine, the one that Denise liked, the name. And it's basically around 1980, 1981. And the revolution happened in 1979, so it's right after the revolution. The dictatorship took over, a lot of unexpected changes, and the war between Iran and Iraq started. So the country was in a very vulnerable state. So did the people. During 1980 and 1981, when I was an 8-9-year-old girl, my father met with his comrades, sometimes in our house and at other times at their homes. My parents told me not to talk about those visits with anyone. If they met at our house, I went to my room after saying hello. In Iran, after the revolution of 1979, when the Islamic fundamentalists took power, any non-Islamic, non-Shia ideology was banned from public discussion. My father, with his Marxist beliefs, had not given up on his ideology and still met with his comrades for a solution to free Iran from the current dictatorship. They weren't alone. There were a few other groups with different ideologies that had to take their activities underground or carry the risk of being arrested and executed. I liked those secretive meetings at our house. People who came to our house were well dressed and spoke politely and kindly to me. Even as a child, I was visible to them. Getting that attention made me feel special. One of them, a handsome fellow in his early 30s, whom I called Uncle Behruz, was always kind to me. On one of his visits to our house, I told him my parents had gotten me a small microscope and I was trying to learn to work with it. I was proud of it. Because of the war between Iran and Iraq, our family struggled financially, so the microscope was precious. Uncle Behruz asked my father to bring me to his house so I could see his telescope to compare what I see between too far and too close in those two devices. I was so thrilled. A few days later, one afternoon, my father asked me to get ready to go to Uncle Behruz's house. I put on my best clothes and combed my hair. In the mirror of my white vanity, I tried to make sure I looked good. My always impatient father called me. I'm leaving, Shabnam. Hurry if you're joining me. Uncle Behruz's apartment was close, so we got there quickly. It was in an upper-class neighborhood in Tehran, in a 5-story building. It felt so romantic to take the smooth elevator with the modern design on the floor and a few small lights illuminating the painting on the wall. When we walked into his apartment, I felt I was walking in my dreamland. All the bookshelves were full of Farsi and English books. With his big smile, he welcomed us and asked me to feel free to look at anything. The bedroom door was open and I immediately spotted the telescope. He said we had to wait for a little until it was darker. Then he could show me the stars. He fixed a drink for my father and they started talking. I wandered and played with books, imagining myself living in that apartment. I even dreamed of being his wife and discussing all those books with him over dinner. I wanted that lifestyle, a small, chic apartment in a nice neighborhood in Tehran, full of Farsi and English books. While I daydreamed, I heard their conversation. Uncle Behruz complained, "I'm worried about completing my education. I left everything incomplete in California to join the revolution that was supposed to free us from dictatorship. We are dealing with a worse one now. What is this? We are still hiding. I heard the regime has arrested so many of our comrades already." I pretended I was busy with Uncle Behruz's books, but listened carefully, a wave of fear rushing to my heart. I loved my father, even if he drank every night and shouted and yelled at us. He was the one who brought me books. He was the one who brought elegant people to our house and took us to their homes. He was the one who wiped my tears when I awoke from a nightmare. Would they arrest him too? When it got darker, while adjusting his telescope with a naughty smile, Uncle Behruz asked if I wanted to see the neighbor's house through their windows. My father objected. "No, Behruz, don't teach her to be nosy." When he put me behind the lens, I was fascinated. Although the stars didn't look as big as I expected with the telescope, but his explanation of the location of the stars made sense. He showed me Orion. The world was much bigger than Iran. The urge and curiosity to see other places replaced the fear in my heart for a few minutes. On the way home, we were silent. My father was deep in his thoughts. I asked him, "Baba, will they arrest you and Uncle Behruz?" He mumbled, "I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to worry about that." His face looked depressed. Everything coming out of his mouth used up so much energy. He could barely talk. From that night, I developed a habit of going to my parents' room in the middle of the night to check if he was still there. I cried almost every day. And when my mother asked what I was worried about, I said, "What if Baba has to go to the front line to fight with Iraqis?" I was trying to be a secret keeper and not tell my mother, what I had heard from Baba and Uncle Behruz. She reassured me that my father had finished his mandatory military service when he was young, and at his age now, he was past the compulsory calling of the front line. That didn't calm me down. One day, my father came home in a rush, asking my mother to help him to gather all his books. He said, "They arrested a few of my friends." He walked toward his bookcase in the corner of the living room and continued, "Hassan, my childhood neighbor who joined the Islamic Guard, just told me his boss ordered them to search houses of the suspects for books and documents. If he signed a paper stating that he would not continue his political activities, he explained, they would leave him alone. But I still need to get rid of the books, all of them, not just the ones about Marx or Lenin or Kianuri." His face was white. There seemed no life left in him. His ideology was his dignity, and now the regime was taking even that. "What will you do with them?" my mother asked, his eyes wide with concern. Baba stared at the book in his hand and responded, "My brother agreed to burn them in his shop outside of Tehran. I have to go there now." Puzzled and angry, I watched them collecting the books. None of those unpleasant characters I had learned about in my books did such a thing. This was like felching your books, forcing the owner to do the dirty job of gathering them. I held my tears to avoid making the situation worse. But I had planned to read all those books as I grew up. I was so proud of having them. My father always reminded me, people who read books understand more. My father had encouraged me to take a special care of our books. We wrapped them with newspaper when reading them to maintain them in good shapes. He had told me that under the current regime, There would be few translations of foreign books, and those would be censored. Whole intact books like the ones he had were not permitted anymore. It felt like they would burn a part of me. If I felt like that, I imagined my father's entire existence was going up in flames. In a couple of hours, more than 1,000 books from the bookcase in the living room and their bedroom closet were gathered into two big suitcases, a few bags. My parents each grabbed one of the suitcases, holding their breath, quietly carrying the heaviness of it physically and mentally down to the garage. They placed everything in the trunk of the car, hoping not to attract the neighbors' attention. We had 3 neighbors living in the same building using the same garage. I was sitting on the countertop behind the kitchen window and watching outside. In a few minutes, my pale-faced father came out of the garage and drove away to destroy his beloved books. I went back to my room to look at what remained. Luckily, the little black fish, Aldous and her talking doll, and all other series written by my favorite author, Samat Behrangi, were still there. The few books left were my treasure. My father signed the paperwork that indicated he would step down from his political activities. However, a piece of paper at the local police station did not guarantee the ever-changing arbitrary laws of the regime. Those sophisticated people that I liked very much never came to our house again. Uncle Behruz returned to America. Sorry. Many people I had met in their elegant parties, including the great Iranian poet Feridun Moshiri, had to step down from their political activities. Whoever did not sign the paperwork or leave the country was arrested. They had unthinking few minutes trials only to hear their punishment. They were forbidden to hire lawyers. Under the Islamic trial cases, they were mostly convicted of being the Soviet Union's spies. The majority were executed right away. Only more alcohol could help my father. Thank you. I would like to know if there are any questions, any comments, any curiosity about this story or people in Iran. I would love to talk about it.
One lady did put a comment in the chat. She said, "You are so brave to share this story and to read that excerpt. Thank you." So people, audience people, you can unmute yourself and you can turn your videos on and you can talk to her.
Yeah, I have a question to ask. This is a wonderful, wonderful session. Thank you so much for sharing. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, I was wondering, you said there was a microscope and a telescope. Did you study under microscope too, or just a telescope?
I tried, but it was really a toy, and I couldn't see much. Like as long as it was like a worm that I could even see it without equipped eyes, I could just see a little bit more detail. But I loved it. I felt like a chemist.
I know. Did you go to school? Did you, during the war, the schools were open?
They were open for most of the time, except a couple of episodes that they closed the schools because of the bombing. It depended on what city you lived. I lived in Tehran. We weren't in the front line, but we were in the capital, and the capital had a couple of times of long period, like over a month of bombing or missile attacks, and they had to close the schools for that period of time. But for those provinces who were actually in the west part of Iran, west and southwest, that were directly impacted by the war, people couldn't even live there. In many, many cities, they had to leave their houses, just flee out.
So there are two questions in the chat. One lady said, I love the story. I was wondering if your parents are still in Iran.
Thank you so much. My mother lives here, actually, very close to me, and my father still lives in Iran. I have to say that the story begins with my mother trying to get divorced, and actually she was on her way coming to America. My uncle, her brother, was a very supportive brother for her to try to help her to get, my father, he, as good as a person he is, as loving as a father he is, but he was alcoholic and violent and abusive. So my mother really wanted to get divorced. But when the revolution happened, my uncle and his American wife, at the time living in Iran, they got threatened phone calls that we are going to come kill your American wife. So they had to leave overnight. And that made my mother, 20-year-old with a 7-year-old kid, very vulnerable. And she basically had no other choice but to go back to my father because of the unrest, because of the whole change in the society. It just didn't feel safe to live alone.
Another question is, how did you get out?
Yeah, that's basically as I grew up, you know, like watching and observing so many things in Iran, I really didn't see I could have any future that I wanted to build in Iran. And then it's just like I also got married very quickly. I want to say it, but I don't want to actually tell the whole story. And then before I knew, I had a daughter. So it wasn't only me. Now it was my daughter's future too. But the story goes on and on and on. I also got divorced, and then I remarried someone else. And that person won a green card lottery, basically like a diversity visa that the United States offers every year. And that's how, as I was a very lucky immigrant coming through that diversity visa.
Hi, my name is Bahareh Moradi. I live in Falls Church. My American aunt told me about this event, and I picked up your book yesterday and finished it, like picked it up yesterday afternoon and finished it this morning. I couldn't put it down. I really enjoyed your story. I thought that it felt like I was having a conversation. Just reading the way that you wrote so candidly. So thank you for sharing your story, and I'm so glad that I found out about this event. I'm really eager to read the sequel. So I have a couple of questions. The first one is, do you have a sense of when you'll be publishing the sequel? And will Captain make an appearance in the sequel?
Yeah, I'm hoping for mid-2022. I'm working on it, but it's going slow. But the one reason is I'm also taking a lot of self-discovery classes. And the more I take these classes, the way that I approach my story is different. It's like I'm constantly rewriting that narrative as far as how I'm looking at it. So I want to make sure that I'm like not judging people because of what they did or who they were, or even myself, because I really was at a point that I just didn't like myself back then. That's what it's taking me a while to really like write what I want to write. But I appreciate it. Oh my God, that's so heartwarming. And to answer your question, yes, he does come back. Not as strong as it was in the first book, but because my emotions never changed towards him, he does come back, and then I get to the point that I meet my current husband, a wonderful soul, and I just don't want to fall back for Captain, and I'm like in a situation that like fighting a lot of inner fights, because that's a powerful emotion I feel towards him, but I know that I have to let that emotion go. And I do see a better future with my current husband, Mike, and it's just, I hope I can picture that inner battle that I had as a woman in a way that maybe other people also can relate to it, or give a picture that people understand how it sometimes works for us human beings.
Sounds like another paradox.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. The working title of the book is My American Paradox.
So there is another question and a comment. Me too. I can't wait to read the sequel. Could you tell us if your daughter came over and how she is?
Thank you. Thank you so much. She did eventually. That's not a spoiler. She did, because everyone knows. I always say that the second book is a happy ending, because she has grown up to a wonderful, independent woman that I'm just so proud. But it was 6 painful years that we were apart. And between getting permission from his father, because the Islamic law doesn't give me any custody at all. The mother has no legal custody. Between getting her out of Iran, and between the immigration law here, that even though I was the mother, I still had to wait to become an American citizen to be able to quickly bring her here. It took us 6 years, 6 painful years.
There's nothing else in the chat right now. If you have questions, you can unmute yourself and talk to Shabnam.
Sure, I'll ask another question. So you say in the book that you're your father's daughter, in the sense that you rejected the Islamic fundamentalism in Iran, and I'm curious how you approach faith now. I know there's a lot of diversity in the Iranian community. People come from all faith backgrounds and always have, despite sort of the stereotypes, that we see here. Not everyone from Iran is Muslim. And so I'm just curious, like, how do you approach faith now?
Sure, that's a great question, because I had to work hard on it. If I tell everyone that millions of people have actually Islamophobia in Iran, you wouldn't believe that. But because the way that it was forced on everyone, it backlashed, especially the new generation. And I was one of them. I just felt totally against any type of a structured religion. But when I came to the United States, I found myself, I fell in love with the libraries. I mean, the love of the book that I had obviously dragged me towards the libraries. And it was like, I was in the candy store, the kid in the candy store, like, is that even possible to have all these books? And I can borrow like 12 or 14 at a time. It was just like fascinated. And I found myself dragged to books about other religions. I even started reading Bible with a friend. Despite all the phobia that I had, I'm glad I did that. And I started feeling like, oh my God, there are so many parallels in all these Abrahamic religions. I talked to people like to Jewish people and Christian people and then Muslim people and what I knew about Islam, which was a very, very small piece of it. And then for a while, I was really inspired by Buddhism. But each one of these studies had its own limitations for me. And I got to the point that I just want to be a good person. And how could I find the truth without being like the belonging to one religion? How can I get little things from different pieces of what exists and what's offered? And I'm in that path. And I also, it was actually before the pandemic that I started going back to some Muslim communities that are non-Iranian Muslim communities. And I just saw a very different part of Islam, their faith and their humanness, their kindness that they offer is really not different than any other religion or any other people or people with no religion. We are all human. And I'm glad I started taking that hate towards Islam from my heart to wash it off. I still feel very like far away from it. I'm not ready to even feel like not even remembering the details. I don't like it because it was all forced. You know, I was punished by Islamic guards like for having nail polish on my finger when I was a teenager, or many things like that, or watching other people. But I'm also glad that I got to see other pieces of religions and religious people, and to see how every human can actually have a different perspective, and every one of them is valid, and every one of them is valuable. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. That was very, very honest, similar to your writing style. I'm curious, how is your mom reacting? Because I remember from the book you talked about she came from a more traditional conservative background, and she remained religious sort of during your childhood. And now that she's here, how does she? Well, what was her reaction to reading your book, especially in the beginning when you talk about, you know, how severe her punishments were and everything? Like, you know, what was her reaction to your book? And then also, how is she approaching maybe what's her response to your path towards spirituality now?
Oh yeah, of course. It's very interesting because I'm glad I've had a very good therapist during this whole time that I was writing the book, and then I published it. And I remember I was talking to my therapist about this, that like, oh, that now that it's actually getting out, I'm a little nervous what my mom is going to think. And she, her English she can communicate, but it's not like good enough to be able to read a book. But she, with a dictionary, she stayed up until 2 o'clock every night, and she actually read the book. And then we were getting ready for my launch party, and I went to her house to pick her up, and she was coming, and she usually has a big smile on her face. With no smile, she was coming towards my car, and I was like, oh, what's going on? And she started crying. So she had read the pieces that I had written about her severe punishments and discipline. And she said, well, you made a monster of me. I said, well, the way that you punished me wasn't the right thing to do, but you didn't know anything better. The society, punishment was encouraged by the society. Like a parent should punish their kids to make sure that they actually conform and they obey and they are good citizens. And also, she was under a lot of pressure from a very abusive, bad marriage. So what else I could expect? So I'm glad that I started to figuring these out through the therapy, and I was ready to talk to her about it. And we've had a lot of good conversations, and she's coming to a peace with this whole thing that yes, my punishment was maybe too much, but it's kind of like that self-hate is coming out of her, that like I was also under a stress and I didn't have a chance to be available emotionally for my child. Otherwise, the love of a mother has been in her heart the whole time. As far as the spirituality and religious, she's been always very like kind of like in the middle of the road, you know, and she never objected to how I felt. And when I was in Iran, I openly, at least within the family, I openly said I hated Islam. She never objected, maybe because she was dominated by me and my father together. But then later, now that we have conversations, I think she feels like we have closer conversations about like whatever she calls God, I call life, you know, like the power of life, the power of the universe. And she feels like we are a lot closer and we can have conversations that actually get us closer. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Amazing. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for, these are all great questions. Thank you.
Like I said, I just couldn't put your book down since yesterday. So everything is really fresh in my mind about your story.
Yeah, that means a lot to me. I appreciate it. And like I said, I know I'm repeating it, but it's not always about sharing extraordinary people's stories. It's about us who are actually living day-to-day life, dealing with a lot of challenges, and we also have a voice. And when we share it with other people, we feel less lonely. I think that's at least what happened to me.
I have a question for you.
Please.
Earlier you spoke about minorities, religious minorities.
Yes.
I was wondering how majority Shia Muslim felt having their Jewish friends or Christian friends being mistreated in Iran. How do those people think? The Muslims, they have friends, Jewish friends, and they have friends with Christianity. So how did they feel about mistreatment of religious minority in Iran?
It's been very heavy, and I highly recommend a book called The Land of Saying No, I think by Roya Hakakian. If I have a chance, I quickly search it and put it in the chat. She's actually a Jewish. She was almost my age, so she grew up under the Islamic fundamentalists, and she explains it very well how difficult it was for minorities. And I do remember our neighborhood actually had a population of Jewish people. Even like my daughter's friend, one of them was like Jewish, and I was friend with her mother. And they were always concerned because they had to follow the rules of a religion that didn't belong to them. They weren't totally forbidden of their own practices, but they were limited. They couldn't really do it the way that they wanted to do. The number of representatives, I think, in the parliament is like one for each compared to like hundreds of people, hundreds of representatives. I don't remember the exact numbers, but really like nothing. As far as legal issues and laws and things. Um, and I just feel they were always under a lot of pressure. It was getting a little better at the end of the Shah's regime before the revolution. People were mingling a lot better, respecting each other a lot better. But then after the revolution, people didn't have problems with each other, but the regime and the government didn't give them any right to be who they are. And I think Roya really explains it very well, how it's been for her and for her, for the group of people who lived with. And I think the number of the the population is, for both Jewish people and Christian people, is reduced to maybe like a couple of 100,000 people in Iran, unfortunately. A lot of people fled, a lot of people left. Other countries gave them a lot of support, I think including America, and they just left. It was very difficult for them.
Yes, thank you.
Of course. My observation is very limited, of course, because, you know, I was just friends with a couple of people, or but I'm sure, like, if you read, I've read Roya's books, and that gave me a lot of insight. But if she has an event, she can explain it a lot better.
There is another question in the chat. Other than buying your book, how can we support you as an author and speaker?
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. If you can spread the word, you know, if you feel it's a book that other people might like to know about it, if you can write a review for me, I mean, your honest review, that would be really great, either in Amazon or Goodreads. And this is a big support for me. You know, you be here and engage with this event and listen to my story. It's a great support, and I'm very grateful for it.
Well, this is Denise. I know that I am so glad to have finally had you here. This has been wonderful. Thank you very, very, very much. Oh, nope, no, not another. I thought there was another comment, but no. Does anybody have any questions? Is anybody typing? You said do you have that name of that book that you wanted them to read?
Oh, you know what? Yeah, let me find it. Yes, thank you for reminding me. Now my Google is very slow.
Of course.
I'm just putting the Amazon link. It has the name of the book, but it's the journey of land of something like that. Journey from the Land of No, a childhood caught in revolutionary Iran. And then there is another lady. I cannot remember her last name. Faride. I have a bad memory, but she's about like in her late 70s now, and she grew up in Shiraz, in the central part of Iran, as a Jewish little girl, and she explains a lot about the difficulties that they had as minorities. But I just cannot remember the title of the book. Sorry.
If no one has any questions, I would love to thank Shabnam for doing this. Thank you so much, and I am glad to have had the opportunity to host you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Denise. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate your presence here, and you just enriched my life. Thank you very much.
You have a thank you also in the chat. Thank you, big letters, so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, I guess we're done. Thank you.
I wish everyone a great Saturday. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
Have a
very
great
much.
weekend.
Thank you so much. Be safe.